What happened to Lana Hernandez during the catastrophic Texas floods of July 2025 will shake you to your core. A devoted mother of three, Lana lost everything when the waters swept through her hometown of Cedar Creek. But what she experienced in those final moments before losing consciousness wasn't just a near-death experience. It was a divine encounter that revealed the spiritual meaning behind this devastating storm and a message from Jesus himself about what's coming next for America. If you're watching this, don't scroll away. Don't dismiss what you're about to hear. Lana's testimony has already reached thousands of hearts across the nation, and church leaders are calling it one of the most important prophetic warnings of our time. What she saw in those sacred moments between life and death will challenge everything you think you know about divine judgment, mercy, and the times we're living in. Before we begin, we ask you to show respect for what Lana experienced and to stay with us until the end. Your presence here is no accident. God has a reason for bringing you to this testimony today. My name is Lana, and I'm a 45-year-old mother from Cedar Creek, Texas. For 23 years, I've called this small town home. It's where I raised my three children, where I worked as a school secretary, where I thought I'd grow old, watching my grandchildren play in the same creek that gave our town its name. Our life was simple, blessed, and ordinary in the most beautiful way. My husband, Carlos, works construction, and we've never been wealthy by the world's standards. But we were rich in the ways that truly matter. We had our faith, our family, our community. Every Sunday, you'd find us in the third pew at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where I've sung in the choir for over a decade. Our children, Isabella, who's 22, Miguel, who's 19, and our little Sophia, who was just 16, they were our world. Sophia was our baby, our light. She had this laugh that could fill a room and a heart so pure it made everyone around her want to be better. She was planning to be a teacher, just like her mama worked in the school. She'd help the younger kids with their homework, volunteer at the food bank, and never missed Sunday Mass. That girl had more faith in her little finger than most adults have in their whole body. The morning of July 8th, 2025, started like any other summer day in East Texas. Hot, humid, with those thick clouds that promise an afternoon thunderstorm. But by noon, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray I'd never seen before. The weather reports were calling for severe storms, but we'd weathered plenty of those over the years. Cedar Creek had flooded before, sure, but nothing that ever threatened our neighborhood up on the hill. By 2 in the afternoon, the rain began. It wasn't the gentle summer shower we were expecting, but sheets of water falling like God had opened every faucet in heaven at once. The wind howled through our old oak trees with a fury that made the whole house tremble. Carlos came home early from the job site, soaked to the bone, saying he'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of construction work. We gathered the children inside, lit some candles when the power went out, and tried to make the best of it. Sophia was helping me prepare sandwiches in case we lost the refrigerator, chattering about her summer reading assignment between thunderclaps. Miguel was texting his girlfriend, trying to calm her nerves, while Isabella called from college to check on us. It felt like a family adventure, something we'd laugh about later. But as the hours passed, the rain didn't let up. It intensified. By 6:00, the streets were running like rivers. By 8:00, our neighbors were moving their cars to higher ground. By 10:00, the creek that had always been our town's peaceful centerpiece had become a raging monster, swallowing everything in its path. The emergency sirens started wailing around 11:00 that night. Through our windows, we could see the flashing lights of rescue vehicles, but they seemed so far away, like distant stars in a storm. The radio crackled with evacuation orders, but the roads were already impassable. We were trapped along with dozens of other families in our neighborhood. Carlos tried to start the truck, but the engine was flooded. The water was already creeping up our driveway, inching toward the house with a persistence that filled my heart with dread. We moved to the second floor, gathering our important papers, photos, and the few precious things we couldn't bear to lose. Sophia clutched her stuffed rabbit, the one she'd had since she was 3, and I held her close, whispering prayers I'd learned from my grandmother. The water reached our front door at midnight. By 1:00 in the morning, it was seeping through the floorboards of our living room. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A rushing, gurgling roar that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. This wasn't just rain anymore. This was something else. Something that felt almost supernatural in its power and fury. We climbed into the attic as the water rose through our home, destroying everything we'd worked so hard to build. 23 years of memories, photos, heirlooms from my mother and grandmother, all disappearing beneath the muddy torrent. But we were together, and that's all that mattered. We were going to survive this. We had to survive this. But God had other plans. Around 3:00 in the morning, we heard it. A sound like thunder, but deeper, more final. The aging dam upstream, built in the 1960s, had burst. Billions of gallons of water came rushing down the valley with the force of a tsunami, turning our quiet creek into a valley of destruction. The house shook like an earthquake as the wall of water hit. The sound was deafening, a combination of a freight train and a hurricane. I grabbed Sophia's hand. Carlos held Miguel, and Isabella clung to all of us as our home was literally ripped from its foundation. One moment we were in our attic. The next we were tumbling through churning black water, debris flying past us like missiles. I'll never forget the look in Sophia's eyes as the current separated us. It wasn't fear, but a strange peace, as if she understood something I didn't. She mouthed the words, "I love you, Mama." As the water pulled her away from my reaching fingers, I screamed her name until my lungs burned, fighting against the current with every ounce of strength I had. But the water was too powerful, too relentless. Carlos managed to grab a piece of roofing that was floating by, and we clung to it desperately as the flood carried us through what used to be our neighborhood. Houses, cars, trees, everything we'd ever known was being swept away like toys in a bathtub. The water was so cold, so violent that I could feel my strength leaving my body with each passing moment. I don't know how long we fought against that current. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once, but eventually my grip on that piece of roof began to slip. My fingers were numb, my body exhausted beyond anything I'd ever experienced. The last thing I remember was Carlos screaming my name as the water pulled me under. And then everything went dark. But that darkness wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I never could have imagined. Something that would change not just my life, but my understanding of life itself. What happened next wasn't just a near-death experience. It was a divine appointment, a sacred encounter that revealed the true spiritual meaning behind the storm that had devastated our community. What I experienced in those moments, beneath the water, defied every natural law I'd ever understood. The cold, violent current that had been pulling me down suddenly became warm, embracing, almost gentle. The burning in my lungs from holding my breath disappeared, replaced by a lightness I'd never felt before. I was no longer fighting the water. I was floating, suspended in something that felt more like liquid light than the muddy flood water that had torn through our town. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a profound peace that seemed to wrap around my soul like a blanket. Gone were the roars of rushing water, the crashes of debris, the screams of people fighting for their lives. Instead, there was a harmony so beautiful it made my heart weep with joy. I understood then that I was no longer in Cedar Creek. I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere sacred. Then I saw the light, not like the harsh fluorescent bulbs at the school where I worked, or even the warm glow of a sunrise over the Texas plains. This was a living light, pulsing with love and recognition, as if it had been waiting for me my entire life. It drew me forward, not with force, but with an irresistible invitation that my spirit couldn't refuse. As I moved toward that radiant presence, a figure began to take shape within the brilliance. I knew immediately who it was, though he looked nothing like the paintings in our church or the illustrations in Sophia's children's Bible. This was Jesus. But he was more real, more alive, more present than anything I'd ever encountered on Earth. His eyes held the weight of eternity, yet when he looked at me, I felt like I was the only person who had ever mattered to him. Lana, his voice resonated through my entire being, not entering through my ears, but speaking directly to my heart. You have been brought here for a purpose. What you will see and hear must be shared with my people. The storm that has torn through your land is not merely the result of weather patterns or natural disasters. It is a sign, a warning, a call to repentance for a nation that has forgotten its God. I wanted to speak, to ask about Sophia, about Carlos, about whether my family was safe. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself overwhelmed by his presence, by the love that emanated from him like heat from a fire. This wasn't the distant, formal Jesus I'd prayed to in church. This was my Savior, my Lord, speaking to me as a father speaks to his beloved daughter. Look, Lana, he said, extending his hand toward something beyond the light. See what your eyes have never seen. Understand what your heart has always known, but your mind has struggled to accept. The scene around us shifted, and suddenly I was observing the Texas landscape from above, but not as it appeared to human eyes. I could see the spiritual realm that exists alongside our physical world. The invisible battle being fought over the souls of men and women across our state and nation. Dark shadows moved through cities and towns, whispering lies into the ears of leaders, influencing decisions that would affect millions of lives. But there were also warriors of light, angels standing guard over churches where true believers gathered, protecting families who still honored God in their homes, blessing the work of those who served the poor and forgotten. The contrast was stark, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. This storm, Jesus explained, his voice filled with both sorrow and authority, is the result of choices made by those who have turned their backs on righteousness. Your nation has embraced pride over humility, pleasure over purity, self-worship over the worship of the Most High. The very foundations of moral order have been shaken. And now the earth itself responds to the spiritual corruption. I watched as he showed me scenes from across America. I saw politicians making backroom deals that betrayed the trust of their constituents, their faces veiled in a strange, spiritual darkness. I saw pastors preaching prosperity while their congregations struggled with poverty and despair, their words empty echoes in a spiritual void. I saw families torn apart by addictions, by selfishness, by the relentless pursuit of material wealth, children growing up without fathers, without guidance, without hope. It was a harrowing, heartbreaking tapestry of a nation in spiritual disrepair. But the storm was not punishment, he continued, his voice now filled with a deep, aching tenderness. It was mercy, a wake-up call to a sleeping people, a chance for hearts to turn back to their Creator before it becomes too late. Many will see only destruction and loss. But those with spiritual eyes will recognize the hand of God moving to save a nation from itself. Then the vision changed, and the dark scenes of human failure were replaced by a light so brilliant it made my soul ache with recognition. I saw something that made my heart nearly burst with joy and relief. There, in a garden more beautiful than any earthly paradise, was my Sophia. She was radiant, glowing with the same light that surrounded Jesus. But she was unmistakably my daughter. Her smile was even brighter than I remembered. Her eyes sparkling with a happiness that no earthly sorrow could ever touch. "Mama," she said, and her voice carried the music of heaven itself. "I'm safe. I'm home. Don't mourn for me, because where I am now is more wonderful than anything we could have imagined together on earth." I wanted to run to her, to hold her in my arms, to never let her go again. But Jesus gently placed his hand on my shoulder, and I understood that this was not yet my time. I had work to do, a message to deliver, a purpose to fulfill. Sophia stepped closer, her face glowing with divine love. "Tell Papa and Miguel and Isabella that I'm waiting for them, but not yet. Tell them that God has work for them to do, just like he has work for you, Mama." The storm took my body, but it delivered my soul to the most beautiful place that exists. She reached out as if to touch my face. And though I couldn't feel her physical presence, I felt her love washing over me like warm sunlight. And tell everyone who will listen that God is not angry with his people. He is heartbroken for them. He weeps when they weep, suffers when they suffer. But he also rejoices when even one heart turns back to him. Jesus spoke again, and his words carried the weight of eternity. The message you will bring to my people is this: I am calling for a great awakening in the land. Not just emotional revival meetings or temporary religious enthusiasm, but a genuine transformation of hearts and minds. The storm has washed away the false securities that people have trusted in. Now they must choose whether to rebuild on the solid rock of faith or continue building on the shifting sand of worldly wisdom. I watched as he showed me families across Texas and beyond. People who had lost everything in the flood were discovering that their true treasure had never been in their possessions at all. I saw neighbors helping neighbors, strangers opening their homes to those who had nowhere else to go, communities coming together in ways they hadn't in decades. It was a beautiful, raw, and powerful display of human compassion and unity. But I also saw the hardness that remained in many hearts. People who blamed God for their losses instead of recognizing his mercy in their survival. Leaders who would use the tragedy for political gain rather than calling for genuine repentance. Churches that would offer comfort without confronting the sin that had brought judgment in the first place. This is why you must speak, Jesus said, his eyes burning with a holy fire. The window of opportunity is narrowing. Hearts that are soft today may be hardened tomorrow. The same sun that melts wax also hardens clay. My people must choose quickly whom they will serve. The vision began to fade, and I felt myself being drawn back toward the physical world. But before I left that sacred place, Jesus gave me one final message. Words that would echo in my heart for the rest of my days. Tell them that I am coming soon, but not as the gentle teacher who walked among them 2,000 years ago. I am coming as the righteous judge who will separate the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats, the faithful from the faithless. Those who heed this warning and turn to me with their whole hearts will find mercy. Those who continue in rebellion will face the full measure of divine justice. The light began to dim, and I felt the cold floodwater rushing back into my consciousness. But I was no longer afraid. I had seen eternity, spoken with my Savior, embraced my daughter one last time. Whatever happened next, I knew that God was in control, that his purposes would be accomplished, that his love would ultimately triumph over every darkness. The next thing I remember was coughing up muddy water on the riverbank, 3 meters downstream from where our house had stood. A rescue worker was performing CPR, pushing the life back into my lungs with steady, determined compressions. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and I could hear helicopters circling overhead, their searchlights cutting through the morning mist. But I wasn't focused on the rescue efforts or the devastation that surrounded us. My mind was still reeling from what I had experienced beneath the water. The encounter with Jesus felt more real than the muddy ground beneath my back, more vivid than the concerned faces of the emergency responders who were checking my vital signs. A paramedic leaned over me, shining a flashlight in my eyes. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name? Do you know where you are?" "Lana," I whispered, my voice raw from the water I'd swallowed. "I'm in Cedar Creek, but I've been somewhere else." "I've been with Jesus." The paramedic exchanged glances with his partner. They had probably heard similar things from other survivors, people whose minds had been affected by trauma and oxygen deprivation. But I knew what I had experienced was different. This wasn't a hallucination or a dream. This was a divine encounter that had changed me forever. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I kept asking about my family. Where was Carlos? Had they found Miguel? What about Isabella? The questions poured out of me, a frantic litany of a mother's fear. But the answers were always the same. They were still searching, still hopping, still working to account for everyone who had been caught in the flood. The makeshift hospital at the high school was chaos. Cots lined the gymnasium floor, filled with survivors in various stages of shock and injury. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, their voices echoing off the walls as they called out names. The smell of disinfectant mixed with muddy clothes and the lingering scent of floodwater created an atmosphere of controlled desperation. I lay on my assigned cot, staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to process everything that had happened. The vision of Jesus, the message about America's spiritual condition, the image of Sophia safe in paradise. It all felt overwhelming. How could I possibly share such an experience with others? Who would believe me? And more importantly, how could I find the strength to speak about my daughter's death when my own heart was breaking? Hours passed before Carlos found me. When I saw him walking through the gymnasium, his clothes torn and muddy, his face etched with exhaustion and worry, I broke down completely. He rushed to my side, and we held each other without speaking for the longest time. Sometimes grief is too deep for words, and all you can do is share the weight of it with someone who understands. Miguel, I whispered against his shoulder. He's alive, Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. They pulled him from a tree about 2 miles south. He's got a broken arm and some cuts, but he's going to be okay. And Sophia. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Carlos pulled back to look at me, his eyes red with tears. He'd been holding back, holding on to his grief, waiting for this moment. They found her this morning, Lana. She's gone. Even though I had seen her in that heavenly garden, even though Jesus had shown me she was safe and whole, hearing those words from my husband's lips felt like a physical blow. The mother in me wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But the part of me that had been touched by eternity knew a deeper truth. Sophia wasn't gone. She had simply gone ahead of us to a place where pain and sorrow no longer existed. I saw her, I told Carlos, gripping his hands. I saw her with Jesus. She's safe, mi amor. She's home. Carlos looked at me with a mixture of hope and concern. In his practical mind, he was probably wondering if the trauma had affected my thinking. But as I began to share what had happened during those moments beneath the water, something changed in his expression. He had known me for 25 years, and he could tell the difference between delusion and a divine encounter. Over the next few days, as Cedar Creek began the long process of recovery, I found myself compelled to share my experience with anyone who would listen. At first, it was just other survivors in the emergency shelter. People who had lost everything, who were struggling to make sense of the tragedy that had torn through our community. Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor, who had lived through the previous flood in 1987, listened intently as I described the vision of spiritual warfare over our nation. I've felt it, she said, nodding slowly. Something's been different in the air, in the spirit of things. People have been harder, angrier, more divided than I've ever seen. A young father named David, who had lost his home but saved his family, broke down crying when I told him about Sophia's message. My boy asked me yesterday if God was punishing us, he said. I didn't know what to tell him. But hearing that God's heart breaks for us too, that changes everything. Word of my testimony began to spread beyond the shelter. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church came to visit along with Father Martinez from Sacred Heart. They sat quietly as I recounted every detail of my encounter with Jesus, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. Both men seemed deeply moved by what they heard. Lana, Pastor Williams said finally, I believe God has given you a prophetic word for our time. This isn't just about Cedar Creek or even Texas. This is a message for the whole nation. Father Martinez agreed. The church needs to hear this. People need to understand that God's judgment and his mercy often come wrapped in the same package. This storm wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a spiritual wake-up call. Within a week, I was invited to share my testimony at a joint prayer service for flood victims. The sanctuary was packed with people from every denomination in our county, all gathered to seek comfort and understanding in the aftermath of tragedy. As I stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces marked by loss and hope, I felt the same presence I had experienced beneath the flood water. "I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with my daughter," I began, my voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "Not the last time I spoke to her in our attic, but the last time I saw her in the presence of Jesus himself." The silence in that sanctuary was profound. You could hear hearts breaking and healing at the same time. As I shared the vision of America's spiritual condition, of the invisible battle being fought over our souls, I watched faces change. People who had come seeking comfort were leaving with a sense of purpose. But not everyone was ready to hear the message. Some dismissed my experience as a trauma-induced fantasy. Others accused me of exploiting tragedy for attention. A few even suggested that I was being used by dark forces to spread false hope. The criticism stung, but I remembered Jesus' words about how the same sun that melts wax also hardens clay. Not every heart would be ready to receive what I had been shown. My job wasn't to convince everyone, but to faithfully deliver the message I had been given. As the weeks passed, invitations began coming from other communities affected by the flooding. Churches, civic groups, and even some government officials wanted to hear my testimony. Each time I spoke, I felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a divine mandate to call people back to their Creator. The message was always the same. God's heart breaks for his people, but he will not force them to choose righteousness. The storm had washed away false securities, revealing what truly matters. Now came the crucial decision. Would we rebuild on the solid foundation of faith or continue constructing our lives on the shifting sand of worldly wisdom? I spoke to packed auditoriums and small prayer groups, to skeptical journalists and hungry believers. Each audience was different, but the Spirit's power remained constant. People were being touched, changed, awakened to spiritual realities they had long ignored. A businessman from Houston approached me after one service, tears streaming down his face. "I've been living for money and success my whole life," he said, "but listening to you tonight, I realize I've been spiritually drowning for years. I need to find solid ground." A teenage girl not much older than Sophia had been, grabbed my hands after I spoke at a youth rally. "I've been so angry at God about everything that's wrong in the world," she whispered. "But you've helped me understand that he's not the problem, he's the solution." These encounters convinced me that the message was spreading exactly as Jesus had intended. Hearts were being softened, minds were being opened, and souls were being prepared for the great awakening he had promised. But I also sensed that time was running short. The window of opportunity Jesus had spoken about was indeed narrowing. The same tragedy that had opened some hearts to spiritual truth was hardening others in bitterness and rebellion. The choice between light and darkness was becoming more stark with each passing day. As I prepared for another speaking engagement, this time at a statewide conference of church leaders, I felt the weight of eternity pressing down on me. The message I carried wasn't just about personal salvation or individual comfort. It was about the spiritual destiny of our nation, about whether America would turn back to God or continue down the path of moral and spiritual destruction. The vision Jesus had shown me of the invisible battle raging over our land felt more urgent than ever. Every day brought new evidence of the spiritual darkness that was spreading across our culture. But it also brought new testimonies of hearts being transformed, of families being restored, of communities being awakened to their need for divine intervention. I thought about Sophia often, about her radiant smile in that heavenly garden, about her message of hope and purpose. She had told me that God had work for our family to do, and I was beginning to understand what that work might be. We weren't just survivors of a natural disaster. We were witnesses to a supernatural encounter that could change the course of history. The flood had taken our home, our possessions, and our precious daughter. But it had also given us something invaluable, a divine commission to warn God's people about the times we were living in and the choices that lay before us. The storm that had seemed like an ending was actually a beginning, the first chapter in a story that would echo through eternity. As I prepared to share this message with an even wider audience, I felt both the tremendous responsibility and the incredible privilege of being chosen for such a task. God had pulled me from the depths of despair and shown me the heights of His glory. Now He was sending me back to a world that desperately needed to hear that He was still on the throne, still reaching out to His people, still offering hope to those who would humble themselves and seek His face. The great awakening Jesus had promised was beginning, and I had been called to be part of it. The question that remained was whether enough hearts would respond before the window of mercy finally closed. Time was running out, but God's love was running deeper still, and His purposes would not be thwarted by human rebellion or spiritual blindness. The message was clear, the mission was urgent, and the harvest was ready. All that remained was for God's people to wake up from their spiritual slumber and respond to the call of their Creator. The storm had been a warning. The awakening was the response, and eternity hung in the balance.